Hi everyone and welcome to the Arkham Seeker. Today I will be starting a new video format where I'll be analyzing the different player cards of Arkham Horror the card game. This will be the same format I use in my Spanish channel for analyzing the different cards, of course this time in English language. Today I'm going to start with the analysis of the core set cards, dividing them by their class. So in this video I'll be talking about the Guardian class. I'm going to analyze all the Guardian cards in the core set, including the revised core reprints, and judging their value from different perspectives. What does the card do? Its usefulness, depending on the investigator, deck and context, and which investigators can benefit the most from it. So let's begin with the level 0 cards, starting with the 45 automatic, a 4-cost asset with an agility icon, item, weapon, firearm, occupies 1 hand, enters with 4 ammo, and for 1 action and spending 1 ammo we can fight. We get +1 combat for this attack and it deals 1 additional damage. This is the most basic weapon in the game. It offers 4 shots for fight actions with an unconditional extra damage and a slight combat boost. Here, the most valuable aspect is the additional damage, because it offers what is called action compression. This means that with 1 single action, we can get the equivalent of several actions. For example, let's suppose that we're engaged with a 2 health enemy. If we wanted to defeat it without weapons, with basic attacks, we will have to spend 2 actions, supposing that we pass both tests, which of course depends on our combat skill and the lack of the Chaos Bug. However, if we use the ability from the automatic, we only need to spend 1 single action to defeat that enemy. And this is very important, and it is for 2 reasons. First, the fewer actions we have to spend to achieve something, the better. We only have 3 actions per turn, so the more actions we can save to actually progress the scenario, the better. And second, because fewer tests mean fewer pulls from the Chaos Bug. The Chaos Bug is our biggest enemy in this game, because it can make us fail any test. So the less we have to rely on it, the better. A few months ago, I wrote an article at the Board Game Geek website explaining how to beat the Chaos Bug, where I talk about the key aspects you have to understand to deal with the Chaos Bug, including action compression, evaluating the bug and the token effects, control cards, etc. I'm going to leave a link at the upper right of the screen so you can read it if you want. I think that it's an interesting read if you are a beginner in this game. Going back to the 45 automatic, it offers a strong action compression effect, but beware that it only offers a +1 skill value. This means that we still have to rely on our combat skill if we want to pass the test. For this reason, cards like this can only be used reliably with characters that already have a good base combat skill. Also, you will usually find enemies that can have quite high combat values, and in that case this weapon can fall short and you will need to further boost your combat skill, generally with skill cards like Overpower or Unexpected Courage. This is a good standard weapon, but if you have expansions you can find better alternatives. However, if you are playing a fighting character, it's still a good card. Its only problem is that it's an expensive card. 4 resources are a lot in this game, but this is quite common with most weapon cards, at least the good ones. Most weapons can be quite expensive. For this reason, if you are building a fighting character, you should be really careful with your resource economy. You need to generate more resources than usual in order to pay for your key cards. The core set offers a few cards to generate extra resources, like Emergency Catch, which is a great card in any deck that requires additional resources. Overall, summing up, this is the template for the basic weapon in the game. it offers 4 reliable attacks with an additional damage, which is great. Just beware of your resource economy because the card is expensive. And remember that some enemies can get out of reach of this card if their combat value is too high. So save your cards with combat icons to throw to these enemies, as this +1 skill value will not be enough in some cases. Then we have Physical Training, a 2-cost asset with willpower and combat icons, talent, and offers 2 free triggered abilities. Both cost 1 resource and let us gain a +1 skill value for a willpower or combat test. Note that you can activate these abilities multiple times in the same test if you want to. You can perfectly spend 3 resources and get a +3 skill value for a single willpower or combat test. This is an easy way of boosting one of these 2 skills by simply paying resources 1-to-1. However, in practice, this card is deceptively expensive. It's very easy to spend too many resources in these skill boosts, and this can really hurt your resource economy, because these resources could have been spent in playing other cards or doing things that are more useful than raising your chances of passing a single test. Also, if you don't evaluate the chaos bag properly and you overpay for skill boosts that you don't need, it's very easy to completely wreck your resource economy. Cards like this are only viable if your character has a very good resource economy. This means if your character can easily generate many more resources than usual. And also if that character doesn't really have better ways of boosting these skills. However, if you only have a small collection or only a core set, this can be a good filler asset if you don't have better alternatives. For example, this can be a good level 0 card for Roland or Skids. I think it's quite better for Roland, as his willpower and combat are decent to good. And if you want to pass tests, a good base skill value is almost mandatory, except in some extreme cases. Overall, this card offers a good way of boosting 2 skills that are usually important for Guardians. Their combat is important because they are usually fighting characters and should be built as that. And willpower is important to defend ourselves from the encounter deck. However, this card is too expensive in the long run and ends up compromising your strategy in terms of resources. In my opinion, it's only good in characters that generate more resources than usual, like Jenny Barnes, for example, because she generates twice as many resources as other investigators. Then we have the Beat Cop level 0 version, as we have a level 2 version that we'll see later in this video. It's a 4-cost asset with a combat icon, ally, police, occupies the ally slot, gives us a static +1 combat skill value, and as a free triggered ability, we can discard him from play and deal 1 damage to an enemy at our location, soaks 2 damage and 2 horror. This is a very interesting card because it offers many interesting things. First, it shows us the concept of a static skill boost. As long as we keep him in play, we have +1 skill for every single combat test we take. This can be pretty valuable if we're going to take combat tests frequently, which usually happens if we are a fighting character, very usual in Guardian class. Static boosts are usually a good way of beating the chaos bug, as long as our combat-based skill is good, because it's active in every single combat test we take, and that's great. Then we have this free triggered ability that let us sacrifice him, discard him from play, to deal 1 strike damage to an enemy at our location. Strike damage to enemies is usually pretty strong. In this game, it's not easy to deal damage to enemies, so cards and effects that let us deal damage to enemies more when it doesn't require skill tests or actions, like in this case, are usually great. The problem is that if we trigger that ability, the cost of opportunity is very high, because we are losing the combat boost, the 2 soaks, and we've wasted, quoting wasted, the 4 resources that it costed. However, it's still a good situational ability that can solve a few complicated situations, but my advice is that you don't trigger this ability unless you really need that damage to an enemy. Finally, this card also highlights damage and horror soaks. If you receive damage and or horror, remember that you can assign any amount of them to an asset you control that can soak that damage or horror, as long as it's not higher than its maximum value. But if an asset receives lethal damage or horror, it's defeated and discarded. In particular, guardians and fighting characters in general tend to have a good health but poor sanity. So in this case, the 2 horror soak can be pretty useful. For example, in the case of Roland, he has 9 health and 5 sanity. These 2 horror soak can be pretty helpful for him, as horror poses a big threat for him. As you can see, this is a very complete card that offers several interesting things. However, it also occupies what I think is the most important asset slot, which is the ally slot. You only have one single ally slot, so it's very important to choose a card that gives us the biggest possible advantage for that slot. I think that this card is a good investment for that slot, but you can find better alternatives in some decks. Overall, this is a good and simple ally for fighting character. He boosts your most important skill, which is combat, soaks a bit of damage and horror, and can be sacrificed for straight damage if you need it. I think that there are better level 0 Guardian allies, but he is still a good option in general. Let's move up to First Aid, level 0 version. A 2-cost asset with a willpower icon, talent, science, enters with 3 supplies and must be discarded if it runs out of supplies. Beware that if the card didn't say that, it will not be discarded if it runs out of uses. For example, if you have the 45 automatic and it runs out of ammo, you don't discard it from play. Here, First Aid explicitly says that it must be discarded if it has no supplies. For one action and spending 1 supply, we can heal 1 damage or horror from an investigator at our location. So this is a healing card. It lets us spend actions 1-to-1 to heal damage or horror. That's great in theory. The problem is that this is a very slow effect in terms of action efficiency. Consider that you have to spend an action to play it, and this still does nothing. Then you have to spend additional actions to activate it, healing just 1 point per action. In the end, you spend 4 actions, that's more than a turn, to heal 3 damage or horror. That's way too slow. Even if the healing is good, you spend actions that easily could have spent in things that are more helpful. However, this is not a totally unplayable card. It's still a good filler asset if you don't have expansion. And also, certain characters that need more healing than usual can make good use of it. For example, Mark Harrigan from the Carcosa expansion really benefits from damage healing, and he can take this card in some cases, but I think that it's easy to find better healing alternatives in expansion, even for him. Although healing is usually nice, I think that it's a bit overrated in this game. It's better to include other types of cards rather than healing, unless they are very cheap and efficient. This card in particular is way too slow, because you have to spend too many actions in relation with the healing that you get. It's too inefficient in terms of actions. Then we have the Machete, a 3-cost asset with a combat icon, item, weapon, melee, occupies 1 hand, and for 1 action we can fight. We get +1 combat for this attack, and if the target enemy is the only enemy engaged with us, the attack deals 1 additional damage. In this case, we have a melee weapon, which has the advantage of infinite uses. It's not limited by any amount of uses. As long as we keep it in play, we can activate it to fight with a combat boost and a possible extra damage. In practice, it's moderately easy to gain that extra damage, because as a fighting character, we will be engaged with enemies pretty frequently, and it's not too hard to play around to have a single engaged enemy and attack for the extra damage. As I said before, it's important to compare each weapon with the template weapon, which is the 45 automatic. As you can see, the ability is almost identical, +1 skill value and the additional damage, which is just a bit harder to obtain. But the Machete has the advantage of infinite uses. So the automatic is a safer option, but has a shorter lifespan and it's a bit more expensive. The Machete is cheaper and more efficient, although you will have to play around a bit for the extra damage. For me, this is the best level 0 weapon in the core set, and a great option for any combat character. It has a reasonable price and a great damage output, as long as you play around a bit, but again, it can still fall short for tough enemies, and you will need additional combat boosts or buy level 1+ weapons, which can be more effective against tough enemies. Let's continue with the Guard Dog, a 3-cost asset with a combat icon. Ally creature occupies the ally slot and has a reaction ability. When an enemy attack deals damage to the Guard Dog, we can deal 1 damage to the attacking enemy. And beware that we can trigger this ability even if the damage would defeat the dog. The word when means that it's resolved when the condition triggers, but before it is resolved. Soaks 3 damage and 1 horror. Let's start with the obvious. This card soaks 3 damage and 1 horror, which is nice, but its quality lies on the reaction ability that let us deal straight damage to enemies. As before, straight damage is usually pretty useful, in particular if it's testless and actionless, like in this case. The problem is that the triggering condition is that the dog has to take damage from an enemy attack, and this has a few minor issues. First, enemy attacks are something that you generally don't want, as they contribute to defeating you. And second, if these attacks deal horror, we still have to take the horror, as the dog only soaks 1. It's defeated with the first horror point we assign to it. However, there are certain situations where this card can be great, in particular against enemies that only attack for damage. For example, it's ideal for taking down an Acolyte, as it's a dangerous enemy because it enters play with Doom, and can be dispatched with a single trigger of the dog's ability. It has a quite interesting advantage over the cop, which is that the ability can be triggered multiple times if we play well, dealing 3 damage and soaking these 3 and 1. However, beware that unlike the cop, the dog doesn't help in combat, as it doesn't improve our chances of passing combat tests. So we still have to rely on our weapons and combat skill. Overall, I think that the dog is a tiny bit better than the cop as a level 0 ally, because the amount of damage it can deal is higher. But note that it doesn't help in combat and doesn't really soak horror. So the cop still has some advantages, and I can even see some decks using both of them. Let's move on to the event cards, starting with Evidence, a 1-cost event with 2 intellect icons inside fast card that can be played after we defeat an enemy and discovers 1 clue at our location. This is a very simple card that lets us help a bit with clue gathering. It's played under a triggering condition that is going to be pretty common for us as fighting characters, which is defeating an enemy, and we add a bonus to that defeat as a straight clue at our location. Directly discovering clues is another pretty strong effect in this game, in particular if it's testless and actionless, like in this case. We defeat an enemy, we straight discover a clue at our location. regardless of its shroud value or any effects that impede us from investigating, like a locked door, for example. It's particularly interesting for Roland, because it acts as a multiplicator for his personal ability. He already has a reaction ability that has an identical function. After you defeat an enemy, you discover a clue at your location. You can perfectly play this card at the same time as you resolve Roland's ability, thus discovering 2 clues for free, which is excellent, in particular in low player counts, as the value of a single clue is bigger the fewer investigators are in the game. I think that even if it's not a staple card, as I will run other cards in most fighting characters, it's still a nice card if you want your character to help a bit with clue gathering. In particular, if you are supporting other means of gathering clues as a fighter. Then we have a Dodge, a 1-cost event with a willpower and an agility icon, tactic, fast card that can be played when an enemy attacks an investigator at our location, and lets us cancel that attack. This can cancel any kind of attack, from regular enemy phase attacks to attacks of opportunity, retaliates, alerts, etc. So it's the most basic defense against enemy attacks, simply cancelling them. Of course, the value of this card is higher the tougher the attack is. The more damage and horror is cancelled this way, the better. However, as I said before, this card is only good in a context where you don't want to be, which is enemies actually attacking you. The best strategy in this game is to defeat all enemies before the enemy phase, because if you don't, first they can attack you, and damage and horror can pile up. And second, because at the next Mythos phase, new enemies can appear, and they sum up to the others already in play, potentially creating a snowball effect where it's impossible to survive. For this reason, this card is only good in a context you don't want to be. However, there are certain cases where this card can be a lifesaver. In particular, if you are facing enemies with very high health, which cannot be defeated easily. Or also against retaliate attacks, like the Ghoul Priest. There, this card can be pretty helpful, but really depends on the campaign or scenario you are playing. If you know that enemy attacks are a real concern, this is a good card. If they are not, you should pass on this card and choose something else. In general, I think it's still a good defensive card, but only if the enemies have the potential of creating real trouble. This game's dynamics really favor defeating enemies instead of letting them live, so the value of this card is not consistently high. Still, it's a good defensive move that can save your ass in certain contexts, in certain situations. Not a bad card for a level 0 deck, in particular if you have a small collection. Then we have the Dynamite Blast, a 5-cost event with a willpower icon, tactic that lets you choose either your location or a connecting one, and deals 3 damage to each enemy and investigator at that location. And beware that this card is not fast, so playing it can trigger attacks of opportunity, which resolve before the card itself. So you'd first resolve the attacks of opportunity against you, and then deal the 3 damage to everything, and if you choose your own location, it includes you, of course. First of all, this card, in the right context, in the right situation, can deal massive amounts of damage to enemies. If you have several enemies concentrated in a single connecting location, this card can absolutely destroy these enemies. However, this is not a usual situation in this game, and requires to play around a lot. It's also not easy for guardians and fighting characters because they tend to be poor evaders, and cards like this are great if you are mobile and can evade, and thus creating these situations more easily. Even then, this card is very expensive, and most guardians can't really afford it. The most important cards for guardians and fighters tend to be expensive. You need 1 or 2 good weapons and maybe an ally to do your job in this game. You need an outstanding resource economy to afford a card like this. For this reason, this card is very easy to overrate. But remember that in the right context, it can be an outstanding move. Overall, it's a high ceiling card, but expensive and requires a lot playing around. It's only viable if your resource economy is great and your character has a good mobility. For example, Jenny Barnes could make a good use of this card because of her resource economy and her access to rogue class, which is great at generating resources, at evasion and movement. Finally, the last level 0 card is the Vicious Blow, a skill card with a combat icon, Practice, that when is committed to a fight action will add an additional damage in case of success. This really is the first staple card of the game. Very simple yet effective. Action compression is critical to win this game, and this card offers just that, action compression, and it does it for almost zero cost. It costs nothing to commit this card to any attack, and adding an additional damage can, for example, turn a 2 damage attack into a 3 damage attack. So if you combine this card with the right weapon, can mark the difference between defeating an enemy or just falling short. It's ideal to combine with the automatic or the machete and deal a 3 damage attack, which is enough to defeat a 3 health enemy in one single shot, one single action. This card is, even nowadays, it's still a staple in almost all fighting characters, as it's very easy to commit, offers invaluable action compression, and it's almost free. So this is for sure one of the best cards in the entire core set. Let's move on to the cards of level greater than 0, and we'll go in increasing level from 1 to 5, starting with Extra Ammunition, a 2-cost event with an intellect icon supply that places 3 ammo tokens on a firearm asset controlled by any investigator at our location. This is a very simple card that adds ammunition to a firearm, thus prolonging its lifespan, adding 3 more chances for activating it and dealing damage to enemies. Of course, the quality of this card depends directly on its target. The better the weapon we are reloading, the more value we are getting from this card. It's ideal to reload an expensive weapon, a costly one in terms of both resources and experience points. If you manage to reload a powerful weapon like a shotgun, a lightning gun, a flamethrower, this card can be very, very valuable. And also, if you want, or if you have to, you can still use it to reload a lower level weapon, like the automatic. It's not that great, but still a nice way of prolonging its life and getting more value from it. For me, this is a very good card in any deck that revolves around firearms, which is quite common in Guardians and Fighters in general, as it prolongs the life of any firearm you have in play and lets you maximize its value. Then we have the Police Badge, a 3-cost asset with a willpower and a wild icon level 2 item, occupies the accessory slot, gives us a static willpower boost and a free triggered ability. While an investigator at our location is taking his or her turn, we can discard this card from play to give 2 additional actions to that investigator. It could be any other investigator at our location, or we can also target ourselves. So this card offers 2 things. First, a static willpower boost, and second, the option of generating 2 extra actions. Static boosts, on the one hand, are pretty valuable because they help in all tests we take of its type. However, it's only useful if our skill is already decent. For example, if we are Skids O'Toole with a miserable base willpower of 2, raising it to 3 is not going to make a notable difference, as we are still too far from the good probabilities, good odds of passing tests. But if our willpower is already good, like for example with Zoe Samaras, in her case we're raising the skill from 4 to 5, and in that case, yes, we can get a great value from this static boost. And then, on the other hand, we have the free trigger ability to generate 2 additional actions. Any effect that generates extra actions are usually good in this game, as actions are your most valuable resource. Note that we still have to pay 1 action to play this card itself. So the net value we are getting is only 1 action. But also note that we can give the actions to a teammate if he or she really needs it. So the card can still have a good value for the actions, but remember that it's a level 2 card. We have to spend 2 XP to buy each copy of this card, and experience points are hard to earn. In general, I think this is not a bad card, but if you only have a core set, you'll see that there are better alternatives for spending your experience. This card is only good if you benefit from both abilities, the willpower boost and the extra actions. For example, I think it can be a good card for Zoe, but it also competes with her signature card, the cross, which occupies the same accessory slot. But we can always activate the free trigger ability, discard this card from play, and this opens the slot for the cross. So I think this card can be good for her, but I'd question its value for any investigator whose willpower is not at least 4, in my opinion. Now we have the upgraded version of the Beat Cop, a level 2 version. It's very similar to its smaller brother, but with a few differences. Here we have an additional agility icon, soaks an additional damage, and the trigger ability, is a bit different. Now the cost is exhausting the card and dealing 1 damage to it, gaining the same benefit, dealing 1 straight damage to an enemy at our location. And that, in my opinion, is a massive upgrade of the level 0 ability, because now you don't have to sacrifice the card to get the straight damage. Once per round and up to 3 times, you can exhaust it and deal that damage to an enemy. So you can keep the card in play with the static boost and the horror soak while you deal a few damage to enemies. I think that it's very, very valuable, ideal for dispatching small enemies like acolytes, as you don't have to spend an action to fight, or you can also use the ability to help dealing with tougher enemies. For me, it's a massive upgrade of the level 0 version, and even nowadays, having almost all of the game's expansions, I still have this card as one of the key upgrades for many of my fighting decks, because it's very complete. It helps with combat tests, soaks a bit of horror, and can deal up to 3 testless and actionless damage to enemies. And it can be even better if you manage to ready it or heal it, so that you can get even more value from it. For me, it's one of the most important upgrades for any Guardian and fighting character in general. Then we have an upgraded version of First Aid, a level 3 version that only appears in the revised core set. It gains an additional willpower icon, an additional supply, and the ability changes. For 1 action and 1 supply, we can heal 1 damage and 1 horror from an investigator or ally asset at our location. I think that this card is a great upgrade of its smaller sister, because it can heal both damage and horror at the same time, and can actually heal allies. So you can perfectly target a level 2 co-op or a guard dog, which will be pretty nice. However, I still think that the card is too slow. You still have to spend too many actions to activate, and it's also a level 3 card. So you have to spend 3 XP for each copy of this card. Do you really want to invest such a high amount of XP in a defensive card, more when it's that slow? In my opinion, it's not worth it. Although I can see some cases where it can be worth it, these are generally rare cases. You need a great synergy with healing or allies to really amortize such an expensive inversion of experience. Overall, I think that it's quite better than its smaller sister, but still too inefficient in terms of actions and experience. You have better level 1 plus defensive cards, and most of them will be cheaper and more efficient than this one. Then we have the Shotgun, a 5-cost asset level 4 with 2 combat icons, item, weapon, firearm, occupies both hands, enters with 2 ammo, and for 1 action and 1 ammo we can fight. We get plus 3 combat for this attack, and instead of the standard damage, this attack deals 1 damage for each point we succeed by, bounded between 1 and 5. In case that this attack fails and we will damage another investigator, he or she will take 1 damage by each point we fail by, also bounded between 1 and 5. Remember that we can attack an enemy engaged with another investigator at our location, but if we fail, the damage goes to the engaged investigator. So generally, it's not a good idea to attack enemies engaged with other investigators because of the risk it poses. It's usually better to spend an action to engage the enemy and then attack, or have another investigator evade that enemy first. This is the only heavy weapon we have in the core set. For heavy weapon, I mean that it's expensive both in experience and resources, and it occupies both hands. These kind of weapons require a notable investment, but are usually very powerful, much more than level 0 weapons. In this case, it's pretty clear. This weapon can deal up to 5 damage with a single attack, which is terrific. The problem is that it requires a high combat skill and some luck from the Chaos Bug, as you need a good margin of success to achieve the highest damage rate. In this case, a failure here will be absolutely catastrophic, because you are losing a potential 5 damage and one of the only 2 ammo it has. And that's one of the main drawbacks of this card, which is the low ammo it comes with, only 2. However, this card is a pretty good target for the extra ammunition, which increases the ammo up to 5, thus giving this card a huge value. It's still a high-risk, high-reward card, which is a dynamic that is more akin to rogues than to guardians. Remember that this is one of the first cards of the game's history, and even the designers were still deciding the philosophies of the different classes. Nowadays, cards like this are more typical of the rogue class. For this reason, if you are looking for a heavy weapon for a guardian, for a fighter, I think that you have safer alternatives in expansions. For example, the lightning gun, which comes in Dunwich, it's a bit more expensive but way safer overall. Or the flamethrower, which comes in the Forgotten Age. It's a weapon that can deal massive amounts of damage pretty safely, but also with some drawbacks. Overall, I think that the shotgun is still a strong weapon for fighting characters, but only if you don't have better alternatives. It has a very high ceiling, but also involves too much risk for my taste. You'll find safer alternatives in expansions, which have less ceiling but are way more consistent. Finally, the last Guardian card of the core set is I've Had Wars, level 4 version. 0 cost event, 2 willpower and 1 agility icon, spirit, fast card that can be played when we are dealt damage and or horror. We can cancel up to 5 of these points from a single source, and then gaining that many resources. So this is a pretty powerful defensive card, as it can cancel a huge amount of damage / horror from a single source. So it's a great defense against cards like Rotting Remains and Grasping Hands, and also can generate many resources, which is terrific. I think it's a great card, but it's too expensive in terms of XP. 4 XP is too much for a defensive card, in my opinion. I generally prefer the level 2 version of this card, which you can find in the Circle Undone expansion. It's much cheaper in terms of XP, and although it can only cancel up to 2 points, the lower XP cost makes it way more affordable. Also, in general, damage and horror don't tend to come in such bursts. It's rare to receive more than 3 damage and horror from a single source. Not impossible, but rare. So I don't think that this card is worth the investment. It's a great card, but too expensive. If I had designed the revised core set, I would have printed the level 2 version instead, because it's more affordable and reaches its ceiling way more frequently than this level 4 card. So this concludes this first video under this format, the first one I do in English language. I hope I've expressed myself clearly and that you have enjoyed it. My plan is to keep doing more videos like this, at least covering the analysis of the core set. So the next video will be very similar to this one, but going over the Seeker class, the Seeker cards in the revised core set. So thanks for watching, and till we meet again here at the Arkham Seeker.